Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jason Miles, here for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Glad to have you here. If you like what we're doing, please hit like and subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a very long way. If you are a returning listener, subscriber, or one of our very valued patrons, so good to have you back. So good to be back. Last week was a crazy week here at TIR, as not only did we do a ton of shows, but YouTube took the time to remove a few of our live streams and block us from live streaming for a few days. We made some edits to the intro video, as you can see, and hopefully that is enough to stop the censorship from the YouTube bot army. Literally minutes before we went live, I finally got the email from YouTube to say why they pulled the video. They said we violated the firearm standard because per YouTube's community firearm standards, no one can have a video where someone is holding, aiming, or transporting firearms. And as you know from our intro video that we've been showing for the last 5 years,
we coming for you, nigga.
Yep. YouTube came after us. Don't know why. But apparently we're too hot for TV. That said, we're continuing our Star Wars month here at TIR. This Friday, we'll be watching maybe my favorite in the series, Empire Strikes Back. If you'd like to join us for these movie night watch parties, there's one way. Actually, this is a couple ways. You can become a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber. You'll get access to the champagne rooms. Join us for these movie nights. And as a patron, you get exclusive TIR merch. And you can make sure that This is Revolution can continue to stay on the air producing irreverent, intelligent, and insane programs. As little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can join us for these watch parties. We're going to the champagne room after this show. Toussaint is going to join me. It's going to be a good time. There is new information on the little Brazzy situation that Toussaint and I are going to discuss. We found Brazzy's dad, and poor little Brazzy has been getting pressed, as you young people say, for his quote-unquote gang affiliate. It'll be fun. Trust me. Now, let's talk a little bit about understanding the economy. The economy is often treated as an enigma, complex, impersonal, and at best left to the so-called experts. When it is explained to the public, it's typically through the lens of household finance. Spend less than you earn, balance your checkbook, tighten your belt. But a federal or even municipal budget is nothing like a household budget. Your home isn't responsible for supplying water, collecting garbage, funding fire departments, negotiating global trade deals, or employing thousands of workers. Still, the simplification has become the default in media discourse, and it's used to justify cuts to public services, privatization, and tax policies that overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy. Layer onto this a deeply confused understanding of socialism and capitalism, and you have a public that's misinformed at best and actively manipulated at worst. Our guest today argues that the economy we live in isn't genuinely capitalist, at least not in the way the term is properly understood, and that a more honest, bipartisan economic education is possible. He wants to strip away ideological distortions and reveal how the economy actually works. But can we really talk about the economy without talking about power, especially the power of capital over labor? Can a bipartisan framework adequately address systemic inequality, racialized economic exclusion, or the global history of exploitation that underpins wealth accumulation? Howard Yaruss is the author of Understandable Economics, because understanding the economy is easier than you think. A book that aims to give average Americans the tools to decode government policy, from Trump's tariffs to the myth that tax cuts for the rich produce jobs. As Yaruss writes, quote, labels like capitalists and socialists have become so distorted and politicized over time that they serve more often as insults than as a succinct and accurate summary of someone's worldview, unquote. But if the labels have lost their meaning, does that mean the systems they describe have disappeared? Or are we just less equipped to name them? Today we ask, can the economy ever be separated from politics, and who benefits when we pretend that it can? To help me with this discussion is my homie, my dog, my co-host, the man of the Mau Mau Hour, the Prince of Miami, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
How are you?
Well, all right.
Does that mean you're in a good mood?
Well, all right.
We'll take that as a yes. We're going to take it as a yes. Also, this young man is often behind the scenes. So much we've done. Quinn has been there. When we did the DC live event, Pascal, if you remember, Quinn helped set up the audio video, so we were able to record it. Quinn makes, I think at this point, Quinn has made all of the intro videos, except for the one we lost when we had to change streaming platforms. So coming all the way live from his home, in my home, the Bay Area, the Quintern, Quinn Kowitz.
What is up? I'm coming for your spot, Gene. I'm taking all the video production. Let's go.
Gene Bajlan, you are warned. And
I'm sorry. Do these count as guns, YouTube?
Don't point your finger guns. They're loaded. Those are loaded finger guns, ladies and gentlemen. And coming all the way live from a secret bunker somewhere in the East Coast is our guest today, author. And wherever you're watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description to get his book. Please welcome Mr. Howard Yaruss.
Good evening. Great to be here.
How are you, Howard? Thank you again so much for taking the time to.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, no problem. No problem. When your publicist reached out, I didn't even look at the book. I just saw. She goes, I got a guy that is writing about the Trump tariffs. Was I think the first thing she said. I was like, oh, yeah. Not like positively, right? Well, I have some questions kind of breaking down your book. You define the economy by asking who gets what and who does what.
Exactly. That's the most basic question. That's the difference between finance, which deals with people's personal money, and economics, which is much broader. Who gets what and who does what. Mm-hmm.
It's a helpful frame, but it's one that can flatten the class struggle. Why is there no serious engagement with the role of capital versus labor, especially in the who gets what, as it's historically determined? If the economy, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. First of all, how many people? There are four of us here. How many of you have taken a course in economics?
I've taken a course
in college, right?
In college, many years ago.
I went to high school in New York City, and we had to take trigonometry, but we never took economics, which I thought was, and I have a healthy respect for math, and I thought that was crazy. And then when you get to college, some people take courses in economics, and what they confront a bewildering array of formulas and unrealistic assumptions and jargon, and it leaves them with no better understanding of how the economy works than they had before they took the course. So I think there's a real problem with the way, that economics isn't really taught to most people. And when it is taught, it's not taught particularly well. Economics is about, as you precisely said, it's about who does what and who gets what. And that involves values. That involves important decisions about morality and what you think is fair. It's not something that you just can plug numbers into a formula and come up with an answer. There's no right answer. There's only an answer that makes sense to people, that people think is fair. And so if you outsource these very important decisions to the quote unquote experts, to the quote economists, people can get an outcome that they really, really don't like. People have to be engaged with these issues if they want to live in a society that they think is just and fair.
Well, Mr. Yaruss, I want to ask you a question.
Howard.
Howard, thank you. When we have things like classical economics and we have things like the Chicago School, we have all these schools of economics that have a pre-baked in understanding of the direction of what the results should be and already favor certain kind of systems. Doesn't that already tell us that economics as a discipline is kind of rigged to certain players, particularly of the capitalist nature?
Well, we still live in a democracy. That'll be tested in about a year and a half, but we still live in a democracy, and we elect the people who make the rules. They make the rules on how unions are organized and how easy it is to organize a union. They make the rules on what the tax rates are. Do you know what the top tax rate was under Dwight Eisenhower?
It was in the 90s,
a
90
Republican?
percentile range.
91%. Under Richard Nixon in my lifetime, a Republican, 70%. So, and Obama was called a socialist for having a top tax rate of 39.6%. So people need to get involved because they're the ultimate controllers of this system. They're the people who put in place the politicians who make the decisions. And that's really what motivated the book, that people hear economics and they think, oh, it's a lot of math, it's a lot of formulas, it's very technical. Let's just let the experts figure it out. That doesn't work. Because if you let the quote unquote experts figure it out, you may wind up with a system you really don't like.
Quinn, did you want to add something?
I have a follow-up question there.
Sure.
I think that with talking about the economy and the role of whether it's like serious academics publishing, not very accessible articles, and kind of pop economists that range from like Pinker, who not great, to like the Freakonomics guys, who I think that like some of their data is a bit screwy, but their narratives are very compelling. How do we stay grounded in kind of observable reality and not get lost in narratives? Because if we're just talking about like what economists think, you show me one economist that says like, I don't think we should have a minimum wage, or here's my napkin to show my work. Versus like, actually talking to someone at the Fed who knows what they're talking about. How do we draw that line, and how do we, as laypersons, come at this without getting lost?
I have a simple answer to that. Don't underestimate your own common sense. For instance, tax cuts for the wealthy. We keep hearing that by giving tax cuts to the wealthy people will take the money and invest it. But here's where you don't need an economist. All you need is your common sense. What business is going to hire people and produce more goods just because wealthy people have more money? Wealthy people, if they get a tax cut, are very unlikely to spend it. Whereas if you have a tax cut directed to middle and lower income people, they're very likely to spend it. They're very likely to go out, go to a meal at a restaurant, buy something extra for their home. And what happens when they go out and engage in that spending? Businesses have to expand. They have to hire people. They have to do whatever they need to do to expand. And that's what causes more economic activity. So again, that's not something you need an expert to tell you. You just need to take the initiative to apply your own common sense. You can't sit passively back and listen to quote unquote experts telling you that throwing more money at wealthy people is going to improve the economy. You have to engage with it. You have to be a critical thinker and think through. Again, what I just went through was not that complicated. I think it's fairly obvious if you think about it. And so you just have to have confidence in your own common sense, in my opinion.
Well, would you agree, though, that a lot of Americans suffer from small businessman mentality, where I'm a small businessman, I have a certain modicum of some success, and I know how the world should be run. I pay my employees fair. whether they're legal or illegal, whether they're male or female. Ergo, all business people function the way I function. I've had more conversations with people to see the world through that lens than through a quote unquote common sense lens of tax cuts for the rich will not benefit the poor. Because again, small businessman goes, if I get a break, I'm going to try to help my employees out.
Well, this is where sometimes people oversimplify things. Regulation good, regulation bad. Some is good, some is very bad. I live in New York City and I serve on my local community board. When someone wants to build something, they often have to go before the community board. And there's basically a heckler's veto. There's a million reasons why someone would have a problem with something. And as long as one person seems to have some problem with something, it seems to slow down and sometimes even stop something that could benefit the community, something that could provide additional housing. So it really comes down to, does the regulation make sense? Is it going to keep our water clean and our air safe to breathe? Or is it just something that's throwing roadblocks in the way of people who are trying to earn a living and fulfill some legitimate role in the economy?
I now live in a pretty unregulated planet. I live in Mexico, and this is a country where regulations go to die. And I've worked in some not overly regulated environments. I worked in the Gulf of Mexico on oil rigs, actually. You'd be surprised of the labor violations that still happen in such a dangerous environment. That being said, one of the things that I've always gathered, especially where I live right now, is that you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, to whoever you want. There's been some new construction where I live. I live on a dirt road, to give you an idea of where in Mexico I'm coming from. And the place I live in is an apartment that was at one point in time a house. And someone told the owners, you could subdivide this house into 3 different apartments. And you can do a lot of things technically, but when you have a certain amount of regulations, they say, well, you can't do that because of X, Y, and Z reasons. But here it's like, if it can be done, it can be done. And you don't have to do soils tests. You don't have to do structure tests, and you can add on top of things as much as you want, possibly to the detriment of the property, because no one really cares. So what is bad regulation?
I'll give you a perfect example from the community board.
Sure.
I don't know whether you're familiar with this. New York City just adopted something called congestion pricing. If you want to drive into Manhattan south of 60th Street during business hours, you have to pay a $9 charge. It's like a toll. There was a 1,000-page environmental analysis done that was required by the regulations to show that this would not adversely affect the air quality in Lower Manhattan. Now, it's clear fewer cars would probably mean cleaner air, but nevertheless, there was countless dollars spent on this environmental study. In any event, the study concluded, after all these experts and all this money and all this writing, that no, restricting cars in Lower Manhattan, reducing the number of cars in Lower Manhattan would not hurt air quality. But now the Trump administration is citing that 1,000-page environmental analysis, saying it wasn't thorough enough. They weren't convinced that reducing vehicular traffic in Lower Manhattan wouldn't hurt the air quality. And the Trump administration wants to do away with this charge on that basis. That's an example of bad regulation. I think we all have our own pet peeves. We all could come up with something that seems silly and over the top. But on the other hand, there's plenty of regulation that is necessary. Every regulation needs to be looked at as to whether it makes sense. The standard term that economists use is a cost-benefit analysis. Do the costs outweigh the benefits? And if they do, you shouldn't have it. But if the costs don't outweigh the benefits, then it seems to make sense. But I think people get carried away sometimes. On one hand, regulating everything just because they feel they can or they should, and other people who are indifferent to the harms that can come by people doing things that can hurt other people.
Mm-hmm. In the book, in chapter 2, you argue that incentives drive behavior, that markets reflect this efficiency. But what of labor exploitation or coercion through poverty and unemployment? Are these not also incentives under capitalism?
Well, in our system, people have to work if they want money. There needs to be a safety net for those who can't work. I talk in the book quite extensively about, on the one hand, the winner-take-all economy, where a small group of people are gaining more and more of the society's resources. And that's a trend that's been happening pretty much since the 1980s. There's been more and more concentration of wealth. On the other hand, you need some incentive. Everyone can't have the same income, or else we'd never get anything done. Again, we started this conversation by saying who gets what and who does what. There needs to be some incentive for people to show initiative, to show drive. So the question is, as it always is, what is the sweet spot? What's the spot that gives people some drive, some incentive, and yet doesn't result in great concentrations of wealth that demoralize most people and corrupt our politics? There's some sweet spot there. And again, this is exactly why people have to be involved in economic issues, because if you say, oh, it's too complicated or it's too much math is involved, other people are going to make those decisions for you, and you're probably not going to like the decisions they make.
Mm-hmm. Quinn, did you want to say, you have anything to follow up?
I mean, you don't get charged if you don't leave the FDR. So, you can still go around Lower Manhattan. But I also think that some of that regulation is a little bit more complicated because the the MPCC, I think, is the city council, or the city council org that does all the climate change reports. Because they have to do like environmental impact reports of that size on basically everything. Mm-hmm. There is a wealth of information that is available whenever you're trying to look at like the environmental impact of different systems and different plans that have been proposed. It might be a little excessive in what it requires, but just to call that regulation necessarily bad seems like an oversimplification to me.
Oh, I didn't mean to throw out the baby with the bathwater. What I was saying is, I think that regulation in particular was probably too onerous. That switching from cars to more pedestrians and bikes, yeah, it's worth looking at the environment, but the level of detail and expense that the city had to go through to prove that moving from cars to pedestrians and bikes would not hurt the air quality was a bit much. So again, it's the pendulum needs to sometimes land sort of in the middle. It's not all one way or the other. That the regulations have to be reasonable, and yes, there should be some environmental question when any major change happens, but people need to be reasonable. I think that's something that is too often forgot these days.
It's interesting you guys are talking about this. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and in San Francisco they had cut off a part of Market Street, which is a main thoroughfare through the city. Mm-hmm. And had it open for pedestrians. Whenever I go back to see my family, it was always strange to be able to walk in the middle of the street, but also kind of nice. And now that's over. A new mayor came in and got rid of it. And what was funny is the complaints sound a lot like what you're saying, Howard. Initially, when it came through, people hated it. You're going to mess with the traffic. traffic's going to be horrible in the city, and it wasn't. Traffic's always horrible in a major metropolitan area. I've never been to a city that didn't have horrible traffic, from Boston, San Francisco, downtown Los Angeles. New York City is not the worst. I've driven in Mexico City. So, you know, you're going to have traffic in a place that has a dense amount of people.
And I'm not saying they shouldn't question the shopkeepers to see how congestion pricing might affect their businesses, how the people who deliver goods, how it affect their businesses. But I was focusing solely on the environmental regulations. What's going to happen to the air quality? I think that is where I think I would use that as an example of something that is a bit overregulated. Again, how it's going to affect shopkeepers or delivery people, yeah, that's definitely worth looking into. But air quality, no. I think that particular regulation was a bit overzealous.
In chapter 3 of your book, it kind of celebrates profit as a signal of efficiency. But doesn't this assume away that the fact that profits often come at the direct cost of labor share? Why isn't surplus value extraction mentioned? Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, absolutely. What happens is a business makes a profit. I think I made that point in the book pretty directly, that and they earn a profit and which exceeds the profit a similar business would make. They're making excess profits, and economists would call it excess profits. And what happens then? They theoretically attract competition. And what does the competition do? They drive down those profits. The problem we're seeing now is this is the big problem I think our economy is facing. People talk about AI or a whole bunch of other things. I think it's monopolization. I think so many sectors of our economy are sort of driven these days to a monopoly or an oligopoly. Retail, you have example, retailing, Amazon, transportation services, Uber, social networking. There are just a couple of companies. Years ago, if someone had a store where they sold clothing in New York, let's say in the 1950s, and they wanted to sell clothing in San Francisco, that was very difficult. They'd have long distance phone calls. And I remember the price of long distance phone calls when I was a kid. It would have been really difficult. Now, with the cost-free platform of the internet, they could be selling clothing anywhere in the world. So it's allowed a few entrepreneurs, a few businesses to really monopolize whole sectors of the economy, making it, one, difficult for others to compete with, and two, easier for them to exploit everyone they deal with, from workers to suppliers to their customers. And I think that's the emerging problem. The problem is not with capitalism per se. The problem is with, I think it's Shakespeare's line, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. The fault is with us for not regulating it. Years ago, when Rockefeller established his monopoly, the government broke it up. The government broke up the telephone monopoly. We might not have these great mobile phones if it weren't for that. And I think the government is now remiss in allowing these companies like Amazon and Uber and Facebook, Meta, to function essentially or as monopolies. And I'll just add one more thing. The Twitter, not only are they commercial monopolies, but there's, in a way, poisoning our discourse because they have such power, not only economic power, but power through the fact of their business, the fact that they're social networking sites. So I think the government is remiss. And at the risk of offending people, when I say the government is remiss, I think we're remiss as voters for not making sure there are people in office who watch out for this stuff.
Well, isn't that kind of the whole thing about representative democracy? And also capitalism. I mean, the profit motive, as David Harvey points out, kind of produces inequality and environmental degradation. And I don't want to hope that a capitalist just has a good heart. I feel like the system in which we live in doesn't really reward the good heart. I mean, there's a lot of billionaires. They didn't get that billion because they, hugged babies and looked out for their workers.
I completely agree. Hope is not a viable solution. But what is a viable solution is a more progressive tax system.
Sure. Yeah.
You can say, well, hope we can hope, but we shouldn't. If we think there's too much concentration of capital, we need to elect people who are more like Dwight Eisenhower, at least in that way, who would raise tax rates. Instead, we seem to be going in the other direction. Again, the problem is not with the capitalist system. The problem is with our oversight of it. Yes, it produces inequality. Some level of inequality is absolutely essential to get people to do stuff. The level of inequality that we're seeing now, I try not to make value judgments and I try not to be partisan, but it's objectively so much more skewed than it's ever been. And if you look at societies through history where there's such an imbalance in wealth among people, they're not very stable societies, and you risk at the worst societal collapse. So again, this is not something that's in our stars, it's in ourselves. We need to elect people who are going to do something about this. Again, not have a completely equal incomes for everyone, but we have to decide as a society what makes sense. And I will go out on a limb here. I try not to show my cards, but yes, I think what we have now has gone too far.
Mm-hmm. Pascal?
Well, what about you're making arguments that basically assume that the capitalist framework is, de facto the normative, accepted, and best way of working things out. What about a system where we have workers actually take shares or means of productions over the work in which they create, where they actually have ownership share of what they produce as a result of the work that they do, instead of simply using profit as the ultimate margin of success for owners? What about the rate in which they share their income with the actual labor that produces and manufactures the goods and services we have in the society? God forbid we call that socialism.
Well, I think the problem is that capital in our society is so skewed and so unevenly distributed. If it were more evenly distributed, workers would have more say in terms of whether they want to invest their capital in their own business or in some other business, and that would be efficient too. A worker may be in a business where they like their job, but think some other sector of the economy is more deserving of their capital. So the problem is not the system itself. The problem is that so many people in the system are deprived of capital. If capital were more evenly distributed, we wouldn't have that problem. We would have workers, if they feel strongly about their business, investing in their own business. There's a structural problem with unions and worker bargaining, and that is that workers could also get equity in the business. And many businesses do provide equity, but if workers had more bargaining clout, they'd be more likely to get that. So there are a variety of things going on there. Again, it's not the system, it's the way the system has worked. It's resulted in capital being very concentrated among a small group of people. If it weren't so concentrated, we might not even be thinking about this issue. And secondly, those are two off the top of my head. Unions, if they had more bargaining clout, they'd be able to argue for a greater share of the profit these businesses produce.
But doesn't government interfere with that union bargaining power? And haven't they interfered with that union bargaining power since Taft?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but actually I am a lawyer, and there's the National Labor Relations Act, which basically set up the right to have unions, and it's been amended many times since, and it seems to swing back and forward as to how much clout unions have and how much clout management has. And I think that people need to go to the voting booth and vote for politicians who would swing that pendulum a little more in favor of labor.
Quinn or Pascal, do you guys want to add something?
Pascal, if you don't have anything, I think it's hard for me to wrap my head around the talk of capitalism as an ideal system versus capitalism as it actually exists in practice? Is not the capitalist system what we have now, and what is the system not what it produces?
Well, one of the things you said is almost straight out of the book. There are really two ways to organize society. People make their own decisions, and what happens, or some central authority makes decisions. The latter is often called socialism. The former is often called capitalism. In the real world, every society, from the United States to North Korea, is somewhere in the middle. North Korea, more centralized. The United States, less centralized. I'll tell you, for one, I don't want Donald Trump making all the decisions for all of us. What happens. I think the system, since the Industrial Revolution, has produced astonishing wealth. The average person is so much better off than they were before that. Most people before the late 1700s were food insecure and led pretty short and not so great lives. The system produces enormous wealth. And I think it's not the system's problem, it's the way we regulate it. It's the fact that we allow these great concentrations of capital. You mentioned workers having a percentage of business. Well, if capital were more evenly distributed, they'd have a percentage of whatever business they want. You have to step back from it and separate out what is inherent in the system and what is due to our remiss oversight of it. And I think a lot more is due to our remiss oversight of it. If we had a 91% tax rate now, we wouldn't have to be cutting Medicaid. We wouldn't have to be, we would have better schools. We would have a lot more. We wouldn't have to worry about the safety net. I think these issues about fairness would be reduced if we had those extra resources and then more fair, more even allocation of capital.
But wouldn't you say even in the days of Eisenhower, we still complain that capitalism wasn't a system that had a bunch of winners? Granted, there were people that were getting ahead, and you mentioned redlining in the book, but it's almost kind of a rosy view of the past. And I think everybody on this screen would agree a higher marginal tax rate we're all for. No one's saying that's a bad thing. But to assume that capitalism functions so much better, we're also eliminating all the government spending that was going on at that time as well. And we're taking totally out of context that the rest of the world was damaged considerably by a couple of world wars and nothing got fought on continental U.S. soil. So the U.S. was able to really become a world power in that moment.
You know, there's a line I use at the community board all the time, and the line is, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. The system always had flaws. Any system run by human beings will always have flaws. The question is, how do you make it better? And that's the question I have. How do you make it better? And so, again, I have it, and everyone should be thinking about this, thinking what they would like to see happen, and then electing people who would do just that. And if people want to throw out the system and build a new system, you could look to history and see if the system that they envision has worked. I'll be blunt. I really haven't seen any system like that starts from ground zero and just is totally new and scraps everything that's successful. If there is, I'm all ears.
I mean, everyone on the screen can point to the flaws of the Soviet Union and say communism in one country was kind of doomed to fail. And even people
that was not
Stalin.
Communism. They called it communism. You know, the opening line of my book, I can't resist this one, is what you probably remember. What do Helen Keller, Adolf Hitler, Oscar Wilde, Joseph Stalin, and Nelson Mandela all have in common? They're all socialists. So
that line angered me.
It angered you?
Yeah, because I don't really think Adolf Hitler looked at himself as a true socialist.
Why did it anger you? That's fascinating.
Well, because look, saying Adolf Hitler is a socialist?
That's what he said. I didn't say no.
The Nazis
I
are
said,
Nazis.
what did they call themselves?
Yeah,
I don't think he was a socialist. He was
Yeah.
a corrupt murderer, in my opinion. But
Sure.
he called
But-
himself a socialist. So
but
that's the point I'm making, that these terms have been so distorted.
okay,
Well,
that's fair.
I do think Hitler did make a distinction between the term National Socialism and
He
like
definitely
the
went
other
after and
socialists,
killed the communists.
which he threw in the camps.
Yeah.
So
Which is that's kind of important. But and sadly, Howard, you know this. How many people don't know that Hitler killed the communists in Germany?
Oh, I teach college students. I hope no one is listening. They know I'm listening. It's shocking. But here's something so interesting. As part of my course, we go on a walking tour of Lower Manhattan, and we go to Zuccotti Park.
Okay.
And I asked them, has anyone heard of Zuccotti Park? Total
Really?
Wait, it gets better.
Okay.
I asked, has anyone heard of Occupy Wall Street? Not one has ever heard
Really?
of Occupy Wall Street. And these are
This is at
college
NYU.
yeah,
Oh,
I
sorry.
think you got some.
I'm sorry.
You got some selection bias. I got a rep for my team. You would not find that problem with the new school. They're all busy fetishizing Zuccotti Park and not thinking about it critically, but you will not have the problem where they don't know about it.
But okay, let's take a moment and pause on that for a second. That's not that long ago. Is it even 10 years?
I think it was 2014, but I wouldn't bet my life on that.
Would you say 10 years, Quinn? Were you?
Yeah, I mean, give or take. I wasn't in New York then, so couldn't tell you.
Wall Street was 2008, 2010.
Really?
No, it was 2011, 12, wasn't it? We're all making shit up as we go.
I
Wall Street was yesterday. It's insane though that moment.
2011.
It's a big cultural moment. Whether it's 2011 or 2014, that's a big cultural moment. And if you're 18,
September to November,
and you don't know the 1%, because that rhetoric is so often used, we are the blah 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 percent. It's used in marketing.
Yeah.
So that's what's fascinating to me. Does that just speak more kind of towards why you wrote the book in the first place?
There's another anecdote, and it goes to, it's a little more cutting. When they were debating Brexit, I remember these people who were on welfare, by the way, British welfare, they call it the dole. And they were sitting on their couch, eating some kind of junk food, watching a giant flat screen TV. And they said they were for Brexit. And the interviewer said, well, why? And they said, well, we can't imagine things getting any worse. And these are people in London who, 60,000 people were killed on the streets of London in the early 1940s. They have no clue, how much worse things can get. And I think that a lot of people, a lot of Americans in particular, are oblivious to, the system has flaws. And, I made this very passionate, I think we all agree, argument that people need to be more involved to make sure it works better. But they also need to step back and realize how much more screwed up it can be. People need to be involved, and they need to have some sense of history and some perspective in order to have some kind of meaningful input into this.
Pascal?
No, I agree. I mean, I think that people should have a better understanding of history as well. But people should also understand that not only that, the problems of socialism, but also the abuses of capitalism. For example, things like primitive accumulation. Capitalism doesn't rise out of anything, out of nowhere. I mean, basically, you have whole civilizations that get decimated, murdered, land that was stolen, people that were enslaved, countries that were burned down to crisp, just to get the primitive accumulation to start this thing called capitalism. And the Industrial Revolution in and of itself cost the lives of thousands of people. So this system doesn't come without its costs. I understand what you're saying, to just scrap what we have now and take it to a whole new level and start from the beginning, romanticizes what we may have, but to act as if capitalism got here without blood, treasure, and loss of life and misery does a disservice to the fact that pretty much up until the New Deal, this was generally a pretty horrible place to live for most people in this country. And it took a system like that to make it a more humane kind of environment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree with that. But I think today it's somewhat of a cop-out to blame quote-unquote capitalism. The system is made up of 335 million people. Mm-hmm. And we as a society, each of us needs to support policies that would rein in those abuses. You know, life was miserable. Life in the early factories, I think I remember this line from the book almost mm-hmm. exactly, were probably the early factories in the Industrial Revolution, the worst living conditions for anyone who wasn't expressly being punished. Mm-hmm. And those are the kind of conditions that some people, especially in poor countries today, some people are enduring today. And maybe we could argue about history. I'm not going to have an opinion on this. Maybe you could argue that that was a phase that some people had to go through so that we can emerge in a more productive society. I don't particularly buy that. It's an argument that can be made, but you can't make that argument today. I think I figured out if you took the world GDP, I do some fancy math in the book, the world GDP, and divided it by the number of people on the planet Earth, you get like a $45,000 a year income for a family of four. That's hardly a terrible situation for the average person. And so this kind of misery is just, again, someone might argue it might have been necessary in the early 1800s in England when they were building the factories. You can't make that argument today. And the very beginning of this conversation, we talked about the minimum wage. There's really no argument. The minimum wage, the federal minimum wage today is $7.25 an hour. The people we've elected to Congress have said it doesn't warrant raising. Now, you don't need an expert to tell you that that's just not fair. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have nothing more to say on that.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, I guess I would add again, I guess the issue that I have is that it always ends in a technocratic solution of the right people will make the right decisions instead of, the people making the decisions. And I think most people are in favor of a higher minimum wage.
Yes.
I think also we look at the minimum wage in capitalism today as what is the least amount of money I can pay someone, opposed to the original way it was framed. What is the bare minimum that it's going to take people to survive on? And can we supply them with that? To your point about how different the world looked before we had a quote unquote social safety net. For instance,
in the book, I say we could provide, and I'm not saying I'm in favor of this. I talk about a variety of proposals in the book, some from the left, some from the right. I really don't care where they come from. I care whether they make sense or not. You could have a guaranteed job for anyone who is unemployed, and the job will pay $15 an hour. And so there's always that safety net, for lack of a better word, that people could take that $15 or $16 an hour job, and that you wouldn't even need a minimum wage, because it would give bargaining power to workers in private employment to say, well, I could always work for the government, building roads or doing whatever. There's just so much that needs to be done, and we give workers more clout, more bargaining power. So that's one approach that can be taken to further enfranchise workers.
But would you agree, though, that with capitalism comes a certain degree of power that capital has over influencing government, right? Recently on an earnings call, the CEO of what's the company that builds the private prisons? I can't remember the name. But anyway, they said on the earnings call, right? And if you were an investor, you heard the call where he said, our investment worked on these politicians. We're going to be able to build these facilities that will hold hundreds of thousands of people. Trump is ramping up this plan to round up about 1 million immigrants a year. and stock prices are rising because of this. Now, this is capitalism in a nutshell. Now, we can say, again, we need
It's
better.
capitalism that's not appropriately regulated. That's the point I've made.
Okay,
You
okay,
do
go
talk
ahead.
about that a little bit in your section on regulatory capture, though, right?
Oh, that's an enormous problem. I was general counsel of a very large financial services company, and it was clear that the regulators were very deferential to me. They were like buddies. They wanted to be buddies because they saw, first of all, they interacted with me. They saw me as a human being, and I guess they liked me. Bad taste, but in any event, they I was the person they interacted. The average person was something who was just annoying to them, and they also looked at people like me as potential employers after they left the less lucrative government sector. So that's the problem. Regulatory capture is a really big problem. But what's even a bigger problem is the amount of money sloshing around in politics. And it's true of both Republicans and Democrats. I think it's worse for one than the other, but it's still bad for both. Politicians need a lot of money to run their campaigns, and the people who write the checks get the influence.
Sadly. Pascal, do you want to add something there?
No, I don't have any disagreement with that.
GDP is treated as a measure of success, but critics on the left argue that growth is an empty metric that ignores inequality, ecological harm, non-market labor like caregiving. Why doesn't the book wrestle with things like degrowth or post-growth critiques? How can we challenge growth-driven policy when GDP increases alongside wage stagnation and worker precarity?
Well, what I think is that you want the biggest pie, and then you want to divide it as evenly as possible. I talk a lot in the book about Gini coefficient, which measures how evenly incomes are divided in the society. So I think that's the most important thing. Degrowth, I'm just being a practical person here. Growth shrinks. It's not going to be the billionaires who are going to be hurt. It's going to be the rest of the people who are going to be hurt. I think slower growth hurts people lower on the economic spectrum than people higher on the economic spectrum. My desirable scenario is where we have good growth and everyone participates, not a shrinking pie where the people who have the power can get an even larger slice of a shrinking pie. I think that's just, I'm expressing my personal view here. Sure. My ideal scenario is where that pie is growing and the slices are divided up more evenly, not a shrinking pie.
Does that kind of get back into the regulation conversation though as well, which almost feels like probably to a lot of Americans that genie's out of the bottle and it's just running around wreaking havoc. How do you rein in a certain amount of regulation when you have a person in office right now that is doing their best to undo not just New Deal and even some great society reforms, but the Constitution? Because what we've seen is even if you have someone coming into power that wants to do away with certain reforms, if the opposite party comes in afterwards, nothing really changes. Obama didn't do much to rein in it. He didn't do anything to rein in Wall Street. And we never really got the reforms after, from 94 on, you really start hammering away at certain financial firewalls that lead us to the financial crisis of 2008. So that seems to be, for me, the big thing that makes people not trust institutions and kind of gives you Trump world.
Well, the fact is, a majority of Americans voted for Donald Trump. And I think the main reason is many of them were naive. He said he was going to end inflation. He said he was going to end the Ukraine war. You know as well as I, the whole list of stuff he was going to do on day one. And I think they were fooled. And that just makes me double down on my argument that people have to approach this as if they're hiring someone to perform a very important function for them. I remember when the governor of Sarah Palin was running for vice president, and she described herself as your average hockey mom. Now, if you were interviewing a surgeon for an important surgery, or a financial advisor because you came into some money and didn't know what to do with it, how would you feel if that person opened up with, "I'm just your average hockey mom"? You wouldn't be very impressed at all. And I think being vice president or president is an even more important position. And so I think people need to step back and say, we're not looking for someone to have a beer with. We're looking for someone to make decisions that are going to greatly affect my life and take it very seriously. And I think Donald Trump got in because people didn't think that way.
But is the problem that people think too much of the fact that the right person will do the right job and kind of don't look at themselves as people that hold or wield a certain amount of power as well? Like who holds the politicians accountable? People can get together to get someone elected, but it seems like once that person gets elected, then that party, if you will, is just kind of taken apart.
That's an inevitable problem with a system run by human beings. I would never. Maybe one day people will advocate that AI run our government, but we're nowhere near that yet. We need a government run by human beings, and I think it's not a perfect solution. I think people need to look more carefully to who they're electing, and there have been some very good presidents. Obama was unequivocally a good president. Obviously, he fell short in a lot of people's view. FDR, in a way, he saved the nation. I'm talking about modern history. John F. Kennedy inspired a generation. So there have been good people in office. Bill Clinton, I'm sure there's a long list of things that you could disagree with that he did, but
Hope 6. 94 crime bill, welfare reform.
Again, they're human beings and there are a lot of decisions. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. The trick is it's Martin
deregulation. Bill Clinton, deregulation.
Just the arc. What is it? The arc of
history leans towards
arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
We've had setbacks along the way. The question is, are you taking you may be taking one step back, but are you also taking 2 steps forward? And there's no perfect system. And the question is, are we getting better or are we getting worse? And I think in the most recent time, we've done a U-turn. It's not improving. And I think the only way we're going to get a better system is if more people get involved, think things through, and assert their values, and try to find people who would honestly and sincerely support those values and work to see that the policies get adopted that reflect them.
So
go ahead.
I have a really quick point just about like dealing with the early legacy of Obama and what he was and wasn't able to accomplish. I think a lot of what is either considered failures or just the general voters being sold a bill of goods is the shuttering of OFA and the infrastructure that Obama for America built, and just folding that into what turned into an email list for the DNC. The inability for the Democratic Party specifically to utilize outside group and outside pressures that don't just rely on state power in order to get anything done.
Well, also the Democratic Party is reliant on donations, campaign donations as well. Maybe not as reliant as the Republicans, but everyone in office is to some extent reliant on campaign donations, and money talks.
Pascal?
Well, I mean, as someone who actually spent, all of the Obama presidency warning people as the sheer treachery of his being, and as being total pawn of Wall Street. I'll have to dissent from praising him as a good president in any way at all. Obama was a pawn of the financial services industry that was used to masquerade its most offensive and egregious illegalities and protect them from any type of responsibility at the time when they were at the knees of
the Great Recession, right?
During the Great Recession. And that was his primary functionality, number one, and that's what he carried out. And that's why he was so important to the state, to capital, and that's why he was preserved so effectively as he was. His charade of racial unanimity as the great uniter as the first black president was a con game. It was a con game to delude people from understanding that this guy is really protecting the interests that destroyed so many people and lost so much wealth for so many Americans. But that being said, I don't think we've had the last decent president for me is I look at FDR. He basically saved capitalism, but he did make the system more humane. But at the same time, we're dealing with American empire here. And American empire has its domestic costs and has its international costs. And I don't think that we should actually be absent in acknowledging that even though things may be smooth along the shores of the U.S., what exactly are the costs in terms of our neighbors in South America, Latin America, the global South, in the functionality of the United States? There are many of these quote-unquote great presidents that have done a significant amount of harm in the global South with policies that they've put through to try to protect the interests of capital and the same capitalists that are providing a quality of life for Americans on our shores over here. So I don't think that we should be absent of that reality in our consciousness and be more critical and more vigilant in deciding who we want to lead this country. And I'll be honest, Donald Trump ain't doing that by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, the chickens come home to roost. We have a long history of supporting regime change and using violence to change the leaders of countries. It's a long history, and I will just add it's a terrible thing to try to erase it, which some people want to do. The only way you avoid future mistakes is by knowing about your past mistakes. So the goal again is to look. The arc of history is long, but bends towards justice. That you learn from your mistakes, and it's not a pretty history, but it has improved over time. And that's what you have to look at. You can't look at how far we are from perfection. We have to look at how far we've come from the past injustices. And it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think overall, we've been heading in the right direction until relatively recently. I think we discussed this several minutes ago. The great concentration of power and capital in our country, unprecedented. I would argue it's much greater than the Gilded Age now because of mass media. I can't tell you how many. I don't think anyone knows how many more newspapers and periodicals there were back then than there are now. The people are getting their news from much more concentrated sources now, and that's a source of power. And I think power, arguably, is more concentrated now than it's ever been in the history of the United States. And I think that is that's I think the big problem we're facing.
Okay.
Pascal, do you want to say? You want to reply? Respond?
No, I'm good.
Quinn, did you want to respond?
No, I'm trying to find data on daily newspapers. It looks like the earliest data I can find is around 1940, but it peaked up in the 70s and then has been falling since then. It met around where we were in the 40s a little after 2010, and it's been precipitously declining since then.
Also, when you talk about economic statistics, it was a much smaller, more informal economy back then. In the 1920s, in the Gilded Age, there was just much less wealth, and it was a much more informal economy. We're now all hooked together, tied together through the internet. that the ability, the mechanisms for asserting power, for asserting dominance, for having the critical mass of capital it's much more powerful than when America was more spread out. There was more people were more spread out throughout the United States, and there was more going on locally. I think we've become more centralized, and the more centralized we become, the more that the people who have power can assert that power.
I do want to ask you one thing before we go, and I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us. Time just flew, and we've been talking for over an hour. If I can ask one last question about the tariffs, you rightly point out that the tariffs are often passed to consumers, but why not critique the broader neoliberal project that offshored manufacturing, destroyed unions, and made workers dependent on global capital flows? Is free trade actually free, or does it simply mean freedom for capital and not labor?
Okay, when I bought this computer, I did not decide to buy a computer manufactured abroad. I bought the computer because it was cheap and good. To the extent you wanted to keep jobs here, you'd have to have some kind of heavy hand to keep them here. We've all gotten so much more stuff and so much better stuff at better prices because we can buy stuff from abroad. And I know that because we wouldn't have bought it if it weren't better and cheaper. The problem is free trade does make us wealthier. We get stuff more cheaply and higher quality by buying stuff from abroad. I might not be teaching at NYU if there weren't more free trade. The problem is those benefits are diffuse, but the people who lose their jobs, the cities like Gary, Indiana, that get made redundant or obsolete.
We have a rust belt, right?
The Rust Belt, exactly. So the point I make in the book is not to try to stop international trade, what essentially Donald Trump is doing, but to continue that, and then to give people the opportunity to learn the skills for the jobs that we do have, jobs at NYU or Boeing or Hollywood, the things, every dollar that goes abroad ultimately gets respent here. And it gets respent not buying cheap clothes or toys for children. It gets spent at Boeing or Hollywood or someplace like that. So that's great for us. I'd much rather have jobs in Hollywood or at Boeing than in a sweatshop sewing together pajamas. There's no doubt about that. That's so much. Yep.
But aren't we seeing kind of this growth with all these free markets for us to go into? Let's take Hollywood, for example. One of the things that's happening 3 hours north of me in the United States in Hollywood is that productions, even for most streaming shows, are happening not just in Louisiana and Canada, but in Istanbul and in certain parts of South America. Hell, there's a Netflix production down the street from my house, as Fox Studios is here. This is where Titanic was shot.
On the dirt road.
Say again?
On the dirt road.
Oh, yeah, down the street on the dirt road. It's paved on the main road, by the way. But yeah, down the road from me is Fox Studios. I can actually see it from my home. There's not a lot of productions in Hollywood to the point where tons of people that relied on those jobs, and I'm not talking about actors, I'm talking about key grips and electricians and carpenters and painters, people that had been in the business for generations are now out of work because of productions going elsewhere. And a lot of this has to do with the financialization of the economy and movie studios going into streaming, which is a whole long conversation that we don't have to get into. And of course, you don't write about it in your book, and it's unfair to try to, make you answer these questions now. But I look at Hollywood, and I also point to California. I'm a big fan of the writer Mike Davis. I don't know if you ever read his work coming up, because I think he had these really accurate pictures of capitalism's failures. And when we think of the Rust Belt, we think of the Midwest, and we never think of California, where was the number 2 manufacturing hub in the country, and what that then does to the population once those industries are gone, all in the name of cheap things. I live in Baja, Mexico, where most car manufacturing is done, and I know how much money people make per hour. It's not a lot. The standard of living is not as great as one would think. This is not Brazil by any stretch of the imagination. So I don't know. I don't think the right person for the right job is going to fix this, and I don't like the fact that I can get cheap bullshit. Maybe I don't need enough. Maybe I have too much cheap bullshit, and I don't need little Bangladeshi fingers to make all my cheap bullshit.
But you're buying it anyway. This might be a discussion for another time because it's a big topic, but there's a term called creative destruction. The economy is always changing. And this is a little involved. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Anytime we send $1 abroad to buy something, anytime it comes back. So that, yes, that we may not be, some of the Hollywood jobs may have moved to Mexico, but the point is that there are other industries that are selling stuff to foreigners. And if we didn't have international trade, there'd be fewer jobs at Boeing, there'd be fewer jobs at NYU. The point is it does balance in the end, but the problem is that it's just not evenly divided. There are a lot of people who are totally, I'll use the technical term, totally screwed by this. The people who are working in manufacturing, or you could go back 150 years, mechanization totally screwed the people who worked in farming, tilling the soil. But the point is, the economy gets bigger and things get more efficient, but we all gain from it, but some people really get hurt by it. The people whose livelihoods depended upon that process that was made obsolete. And in my opinion, if we're ending now, I'll go out on a limb with my opinion. We have a moral obligation to those people to help them figure out what they can do with their lives now, and not to say they have to continue tilling the soil, even though we have a machine that could do it more efficiently. We have to give them early retirement or free retraining or a whole variety of things.
Oh, no. Did Howard freeze on you guys too?
And we're not doing a problem.
You froze. What was the last thing you said, Howard?
Deep State's coming for him.
he agreed with us slightly too much. You froze. Your computer froze on you. What was the last thing you said, Howard?
Oh, I said the fact is that we have to, these people who are hurt by the fact that we can all get stuff more cheaply and better we have a moral obligation to them to give them early retirement or free retraining or something so that they too benefit from free trade. I think we have that moral obligation. We should not say, no, we cannot have the machines that till the soil. You have to stay out there tilling the soil, even though there's a machine that can do it more efficiently. We have to say, yes, you've been displaced from tilling the soil, but here's a variety of options that we will provide to you so that you have some other purpose in your life.
I do want to say this before we go. I don't think anyone's ever said that we need to get rid of machines and modernity is wrong. I think the problem is, and you've mentioned this earlier, monopolizing every industry because the system does need growth. And if it sees an opportunity to monopolize, it will. So when we think about farming, it's not as simple as there was just some machines that came and people didn't know how to use them. It's that there's monopolies that make farming extremely hard for small farmers to the point where they don't really exist in the US like they used to.
Monopolies may not be harmful to growth when they're being formed, but ultimately monopolies are harmful for growth. They're harmful for equality, they're harmful for growth, and they're harmful to a healthy society.
Well, I think we all agree on that. Howard, thank you for taking the time to.
Oh, thank
talk
you.
to
This has
us.
been fun.
Wherever you guys are watching or listening to the book, Understandable Economics, there's a link in the description. It is the first link in the description. Before I even talk about the show, there's a link to the book. Howard, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Quinn. Thank you, Pascal.
Quinn, thank you for coming on, joining us. Thank you
No,
for
it's fun.
making the edit to the intro video so we can stay on the air.
Let's hope it
Pascal
works.
Robert, you disappeared for a second, but you're back.
Yes, I had some technical difficulties, man.
Seems like you're
It
not alone in
happens.
that.
You know, you live in Florida. We're it's Florida. It's Florida. We could blame YouTube because YouTube definitely hates the show. But speaking of this show, I'm going to the Champagne Room with M. Toussaint. Quinn and Pascal are going home and going about their days. But Toussaint and I are going to take a deep dive into the current goings on of one
What's up, Kush? Look, I read actual books.
of one little Brazzy who we showed Pascal to the other day.
Jesus. I can't. I'm not going to subject myself to that.
I'm all in. I am 10 toes in.
As the YNs say.
I'm so in, Pascal. I've adapted the YN language. On my mama.
All right.
will be
I'll
machine.
leave you guys. Peace out.
Thank you, Quinn. Pascal, thank you so much. I'll see you Thursday.
All right.
Did I send you the invite for Thursday? I sent you the invite for Thursday. Mass incarceration show.
Did you?
I did. Now you guys are knowing that Pascal doesn't check his email. You guys can see it.
All right.
All right. Have a good one, Pascal. And I will see you guys shortly. Thank you so much for another great show. And we are, wait a minute, what are we? Out!